So in the summer, I did a video about top 10 mistakes we have done in the mass vaccination. Today, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to tell you about what I think are the top 10 benefits of vaccination. I thought fair is fair. Let's do, if I did one side, let's do the other. And some of them will be direct benefits and some of them will be indirect. So those who would consider themselves pro-vaccine, they probably will be interested at least in the direct effects, and those who are labeled as anti-vaxxers probably more in the indirect effects. And of course, I also believe there's a third group of people, not just these two polar opposites. And the third group, and the one that I belong into, are people who are pro-smart use vaccine and against dangerous use of vaccines. And that's the group I belong into, and I think majority of people actually fall into that category. But unfortunately, a lot of such people, if they're not vaccinated, they'll be labeled as anti-vaxxers, and if they're vaccinated, they just would fall into the category of pro-vaccine. But I don't think it's this black and white. To the vast majority that I think of people belong into smart use of vaccines. Therefore, vaccine use is circumstantial. All right. And in this case, of course, we were dealing with a lot of experimental procedures. And therefore, those who, for example, might have had underlying conditions, very understandable why certain individuals who might be pro-vaccine might have been nervous about using vaccines. All right, then let's talk about benefits. What are the benefits? Let's talk about the direct ones first. So number one, this is, and by the way, I'm doing these in the order of significance to me in my mind. Let me know if you would have put a different order to these, or if you have any other additional ideas. Leave that in the comments. We got fantastic commentary to the last video about the top 10 mistakes of mass vaccination program, and I will actually do another video in the future based on those comments because of all the information that people put in. All right, the number one, to me, the greatest benefit of mass vaccination was that it protected people during the Delta wave, which was the most dangerous wave we encountered. And at the time, this was early on post-mass vaccination. Remember, Delta wave took over the world approximately half a year after mass vaccinations started around the world. And it was very unusual, the Delta wave, because it's the only time in the pandemic that we've seen one variant take over the entire world and basically pretty much wipe out all other competing variants. And we've never seen that before, and we haven't seen that since. And Delta variant happened to be one of the more dangerous variants. And this is also where the concept of pandemic of unvaccinated started. And the reason why is because at the time, many of the non-vaccinated individuals still were not infected, and therefore they didn't have natural immunity. And their first infection was with the Delta wave, a dangerous wave or variant. And a lot of them suffered clinical consequences, including death, right? While a lot of the vaccinated people, they still had the brand spanking new antibodies that were protecting them extremely well prior to the Omicron emergence, which at that point led to the immune escape, meaning that that variant no longer was being neutralized by the antibodies, either vaccinal antibodies or even natural infection antibodies. And at that, after Omicron, everyone was getting infected. But during the Delta wave, vaccines were protecting the vaccinated people extremely well. At the time, also all of the different health departments around the world were tossing data around showing how the non-vaccinated are affected versus the vaccinated, and of course it didn't look good for the non-vaccinated at the time. Once Omicron came around, majority of those same organizations stopped producing that data. Whoa! Almost wiped out. And so that to me was the biggest effect, because at that point the vaccinations very likely saved many lives at that point. Okay, now that brings us to point number two, which is the dogma that is now adopted by basically the scientific community or and authorities, let's say the medical authorities, and that the dogma is that the vaccines are still, of course, protecting you from severe consequences of infection. And the data suggest that, and I haven't verified this, but I'm going with what the authorities say, is that you are less likely to see negative consequences of symptoms, like bad symptoms after infection, once you get infected with COVID, if you were vaccinated than if you're non-vaccinated. And a good example of that will be dysautonomia. Now, remember dysautonomia? We did a thorough video on this. Is basically when your autonomic nervous system is not working to its best capacity. So check that out. And basically, and it's very important element of our well-being, and therefore dysautonomia happens more frequently in non-vaccinated COVID-19 infected individuals than those who had COVID-19 after vaccination. So that's one example where vaccines are still give you good benefit and a benefit of mass vaccination. All right, and then of course over time we'll see to what degree that continues to persist. Benefit number 3, and this is the unusual one, this is theoretical one, and this is the benefit based on the assumption, we don't know whether this is true, but based on the assumption that it's the actually the mass vaccination that would have led to the emergence of the Omicron variant. So why would that be a benefit, right? So there is a possibility that, because we do know vaccines can induce immune escape, and meaning where they can induce evolution of the virus, so that the virus that is infecting us changes enough so that our immunity is no longer as effective against it. And that's exactly what we've seen with the Omicron, as I just stated, right? And the question is, did vaccines induce that immune escape in this case? We don't know this. Nobody's really looking into this, but it's a possibility. And let's assume that it did. Then it could have been a benefit, obviously, to the reason why is because we all know that Omicron is not as dangerous as previous variants. So we clearly have seen massive drop in both hospitalizations as well as deaths, basically, post-emergence of Omicron. Of course, Omicron is much more infectious and so on. And then, of course, you could also listen to other theories, such as the theory of Dr. Gerard van den Bosch, who believes that, of course, Omicron is just a gateway step towards evolution of the virus, towards more pathogenic and more dangerous version. And well, time will tell whether this turns out to be accurate or not. But at the moment, we are where we are with Omicron, which is basically much milder version of the virus. And if, say, vaccines did induce the evolution of Omicron, then could have been a potential benefit as well, because clearly we went back to normal lives, right? And all the pandemic measures have ended in terms of restrictions, and everyone wants that, right? We want to be back into normal life. Now, what the unusual part about Omicron and why it's not necessarily easy to proclaim whether vaccines induced its emergence or not is because Omicron, as we discussed in one of the videos, is unusual because it doesn't have a direct ancestor. So it looks like it just showed out of nowhere. So its nearest ancestor is evolutionary distant. So we have a evolutionary gap between Omicron and its closest relative. And that's not the case what we've seen with all other variants during this pandemic. And there's like millions of these, and they've all been documented. And Omicron is very anomalous. It just shows up out of nowhere. And it looks as if somebody just plopped the Omicron new variant out of nowhere that is only closely related to its ancestor. Now, I did a video on this mentioning that this could be because Omicron might have come from another species of animals, and that has been previously suggested that it could have been mice. And of course, that's how the virus. So that's one of the tricks that the virus has, is that other animals can also be infected besides humans with SARS-CoV-2 virus. And once it's in another species, that's a completely different evolution that the virus now is experiencing, very different from what would be happening in humans. And then if it jumps back, we're dealing with a completely brand new entity, such as the Omicron, which we haven't seen before. Okay, so that one is a theoretical, but if vaccines led to the immune escape and emergence of Omicron, then that could be the benefit, provided that it does not lead to something else like more pathogenic evolution of the virus, as Dr. Gerd Vandenbosch believes, and which I'm hoping he's obviously incorrect about that, and I suggested maybe why. All right, so let's move to the final direct benefit of the vaccine, which is basically the fact that it has led to the emergence of brand new technology when it comes to creation of vaccines, which is of course the famous mRNA technology. We've never used this before. The emergency approval of use of this technology is the first time it's ever been used in humans on mass scale, and we vaccinated billions of people with this technology. And while I think there are shortcomings, that's obvious. Everyone in science and medicine knows that when you introduce new technology for the very first time, it's never going to be perfect, and therefore there will be issues with it, and it will. And you need to perfect it over time. That's what normally happens. The same thing was going to happen with these mRNA technologies. There are potential issues, namely, for example, the emergence of the IgG4 antibodies. We've done a very big series, and it's an ongoing series. Another possibility is the frame shifting. Of course, we also heard about the possible contamination of the bacterial plasmid DNA. That could be an issue, maybe not, but the point is that we now have evidence coming out what might be a problem, what might not be a problem. And therefore, once we identify these things, we can start figuring out how to fix it if any problems can be fixed. A good example would be, for example, mm, working on perhaps we need different antigen amount in order to prevent the formation of IgG4 antibodies. And another example is perhaps we when it comes to frame shifting, we might not use synthetic basis for the generation of the mRNA that was used in vaccines in specific spots. And of course, I've documented that in another video as well. But the point is that's it. It's already out. It's already used. And now we have literally billions of people to collect data on to understand what has happened and what might be problems and how to improve this technology for even better future use. And of course, that's going to happen. So that's another direct benefit. Now we're going to go into the indirect benefits. These are also interesting. So let's start. So my first one, favorite one, was the fact that in this mass vaccination program, it was clearly established, which was not certain before, that vaccines can perturb menstrual cycles in women. So before, this was observed and documented, but it was very sparsely documented, so it was pretty much ignored. But with the mass vaccination, so many women were vaccinated so rapidly that basically it became very obvious what's going on, right? If I can phrase it like that. At first, medicine was ignoring it, thinking that this is just a rumor, but the voice of women was so enormous about what's happening to their menstrual cycles that eventually scientific studies were performed, and it clearly shows that vaccines are one way or another can be affecting menstrual cycles. So that's important. Why? Because it now gives us a direct path of studying this and figuring out what is going on. Likely this is perturbation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So we're talking about the brain hormonal axis. And I think very likely this is because of vagus nerve, which is involved in controlling that as well. And we do know that immune response and even environment can affect the vagus nerve. So to what degree does it then actually influence how the hormones work? So at least potentially we have something now from a molecular standpoint that science can continue to investigate, so that perhaps in a future iteration of vaccines we will no longer see these issues because of other ways we can use the technology to mitigate this. So definitely I think it's valuable information. And besides, imagine, like, we don't want all of our women being worried or panicking as to what is going on. I've made a video on decidual casts. Check that out. Basically, very unusual clots that can be observed as well, and luckily not super common. But like, we don't want half of our population to be stressing about something because it's unknown to us, right? So that's another great benefit. All right, next benefit, number 6, is the fact that this mass vaccination program clearly pointed out for the importance of collecting long-term data. We rushed with mass vaccines during COVID-19. We decided that we're not going to really focus on long-term data. And the reason why is because we were dealing with health emergency and we wanted to solve that issue as fast as possible. And we basically decided, okay, we're not going to collect long-term data. Now we're clearly seeing that, well, there is a value of waiting for long-term data. And the big one is the giant surprise that has emerged with observation that these unusual IgG4 antibodies are showing up in pretty much certain vaccinated individuals, right? So, and that brings me to the next point, right? So this is point number 7, is that the vaccines also pointed out the importance of mode of delivery and how much antigen is being delivered to the immune system. And what I mean by that, when I say it like this, is by mode of delivery, I'm specifically referring to mRNA vaccines and how much antigen is being presented to the immune system. Might be important because the fact that these IgG4 antibodies emerged post mRNA vaccination, and right now it seems only post mRNA vaccination, was a huge surprise. Again, I did a big series on that, and this is the first time that vaccination really clearly points out to this. Again, this has been observed before, but it's rarely studied. These antibodies are not studied often, and they're even studied less often with post-vaccination, but there is some information when it comes to vaccination. So we do know something about why they might be emerging, but this was basically right now the data that is coming out, and I've done I discussed many publications. It looks like mRNA vaccinated, if they were infected first, majority of them, and I mean almost all of them, all of the individuals will produce these IgG4 antibodies. That is important because it now gives us an opportunity to learn more what it does, what are the clinical implications, but also more importantly, to figure out what should be the correct amounts of antigen presentation to make sure we don't see this issue in the future. Because if we ever want to use this technology, mRNA technology, for, say, cancer vaccines, well, clearly we don't want IgG4s in case, because IgG4s could be potentially implicated in cancer as well. All right, so that was what was it, number 7, I think, right? Okay, let's move on. Number 8. I hope I didn't lose my count. Hey, just because you have a PhD, that doesn't mean I can remember how to count to 10. Anyway, so I think number 10 and number 8 is the fact that mass vaccination to the pointed out once again. Now we're getting to the more nebulous ones, okay? Pointed out that there could be a passive immunity. So what is that? Basically, this is immunity that you could attain not because you took a vaccine, but because you are surrounded by people who are vaccinated. And this is still fairly new. We don't exactly know how this might be happening. One thing that has been proposed, that it could be through transfer of antibodies, and another one, of course, is through transfer of exosomes, tiny little fragments of cells that could carry certain information, or really the antigen in this case could be the spike protein, and it could be immunizing people around as well. So there is that concept as well. It starts uncovering something that is still mysterious. We have many, many gaps of knowledge when it comes to immunology. By the way, if everyone tells you, hey, this is the science and you have to listen to the science, otherwise you're anti-science, well, that person is not very scientific, because true scientist always knows we have gaps of information, and you need to be open-minded to new ideas as well. And some of these new ideas can really change our concepts. Okay, let's move on. We're almost done. Number 9. This is the one that I found really fascinating, really bizarre. And it's the fact that your immunity could be passed on to the next generation. Your immunity based on vaccination could be passed on to the next generation. We did a video on this showing this phenomenon in mice. So it was really interesting, by the way, that immunity was a protective immunity. So the offspring of vaccinated mice were protected against certain infections, just as their parents were. And this was seen only post-vaccination. Super interesting. There's some information suggesting that this could also be happening with humans. And clearly another gap of knowledge that we need to explore further, that I found that it was a really, really cool and interesting benefit. All right, the last one. Let's see if I can show you some of the slope here. The last one is the fact that it pointed out to the importance. Once again, it pointed out to the importance of properly functioning innate immunity. So this really, in terms of both whether you're vaccinated or not, and that innate immunity is critically paramount. Proper function is critically paramount for the best immunological response. So it's not all about just antibodies. And the reason why I find this valuable is because what I'm hoping is that basically eventually down the road, this will open the doors for starting to explore how to produce vaccines that can also manipulate innate immunity. Innate immunity, by the way, being the immune system that is always on, always active. You don't need to be exposed to the pathogen necessarily to have it on, but it can be trained. And we do know that now, and I hope that eventually we will steer in a direction of actually trying to figure out how does the innate immunity work as well. All right, okay, I'm gonna wrap it up here because it's getting long, but there's my top 10 benefits of why vaccines, the vaccine program, mass vaccination program, were good, and what we have gained from that program. And let me know what you think, or let me know if you have any other ideas. Let me know if you would have changed this. If you want to comment on the opposite, then go back to my video that says about the top 10 problems of mass vaccination. And I look forward to seeing you in a future installment. Bye, everyone. Ciao.